My Lords, it's an immense privilege to follow Lord Brown of Ladyton. I always learn a great deal from him in the field of geostrategy and defence. In fact, I'm acutely aware of speaking after so many noble lords who have direct ministerial experience in this field, noble lords on all sides, as well as noble and gallant lords who have held senior office as servicemen. My Lords, in common, I suspect, with a number of you, have had the privilege of visiting Ukraine a few times since the invasion, and I never failed to be impressed by the cheerful and uncomplaining courage of local people. My last visit was to Odessa and Mykolaiv in September. Mykolaiv at that point was the front line. It was the time, as your lordships will recall, when there was a lot of talk of this Kherson offensive, but it was a deception, what the Russians would call a maskirovka. In fact, the offensive at that time was in Kharkiv. This was was and is a very Russophone and historically Russophile part of Ukraine. In fact, you can see it in the toponymy. Why are so many of the places there called Melitopol or Mariupol, Sevastopol or whatever? Why Pol rather than Grad? And the answer is the answer goes back to Catherine the Great's Greek plan. That energetic empress had a scheme to try and restore the Romanov claim to the Byzantine throne. She had a grandson who was conveniently called Constantine, and she had this idea of filling that part of the coastline with Russian settlers as a prelude to taking Constantinople. So this has always been a Russian-speaking territory, and sure enough, the people there historically had voted for the pro-Russian parties. They were for Yanukovych, they were for the Party of the Regions and its various successors, up until the offensive. And I had this conversation over and over again with local people in that part of Russia, saying, when did you change? Here we are still with a big statue of Catherine the Great and all these Soviet war memorials, Russian-speaking population that, Odessa had its own Maidan in 2014. It could have easily gone the same way as Donetsk and Luhansk. It was only the merest chance that it didn't. And the answer would come, we had an idea of the kind of Russia that we thought we had a kinship with. We didn't want to be absorbed by it, but we thought we had a special relationship with the other East Slav peoples. But there came a moment for all of us when it became impossible to sustain that view. For some, it was the annexation of Crimea. For some, it was when Putin started lobbing ordnance at Russian-speaking populations in southern Ukraine. For some, it was when he started firing missiles at our own city. But we've all got to the point where we've been jolted out of our dreams. We have to accept that the real Russia, the Russia we're dealing with, is not the one to which we'd aspired to have some sort of kinship, some sort of special relationship. And that, my lords, I think is what makes it so hard to imagine a negotiated settlement from here. There isn't a landing zone between the minimal positions of the two sides. As recently as April, Zelensky was talking about referendums in Donbass and so on. That is now utterly impossible given what people have suffered, especially, I think in his case, the very personal reaction he had to seeing the abominations at Bucha. When you've seen something like that, it becomes very difficult to compromise. How did Yeats put it? Who can talk of give and take, what should be and what not, when those dead men are loitering there to stir the boiling pot? And so as Ukraine now has minimum terms for settlement, so does Russia. I can't see any situation where Putin would accept a return to the status quo ante of between 2014 and last year, because that would leave him having to explain why over 100,000 Russians have died, while the economy has been set back a decade, and while NATO has reached the frontiers of Russia for nothing. So it's all very well for people to talk of realpolitik. The grand old man of realpolitik, Henry Kissinger, says, well, effectively Ukraine is now in NATO, so let's acknowledge that and let's have referendums in the disputed territories. Fine. But there is literally no scenario where either side could countenance such a thing. We in this House might have various takes and modifications. We could say we could have a demilitarized Ukraine and international observers, a demilitarized Crimea. It is for the birds. It makes no difference in the world where these things are being determined. And so we're back, I'm afraid, to the rather grisly proposition that one side or another has to win. That the quickest way out of this situation is that one side is defeated and the other can settle from a position of strength. And when you put it in those terms, it seems to me it's pretty clear whom we should want to win. Anything short of a Ukrainian victory is a victory for Putin. If the front lines freeze where they are, Putin wins. If Russia gets to absorb its new oblasts administratively, Putin wins. If the West gets tired or bored or distracted and stops sending ordnance and tanks and planes, Putin wins. If China picks this moment to invade Taiwan, Putin wins. We're in a world of suboptimal alternatives. We have been since the 24th of February of last year. But surely the worst option is for Russian aggression to be rewarded. Let me say to those who say, why is this our business? Not many, I'm glad to say, in this chamber, but there are voices beyond. In fact, particularly voices, I'm not a great believer in the horseshoe theory of politics, but I notice that it's particularly voices on the far left and the far right. Well, why is this our fight? You know, it's nothing to do with it, all stirred up by NATO and so on. I'd make just 2 points. First, we may want to be indifferent, but Putin has never been indifferent to us. He's been targeting this country in various ways for over a decade, and arguably on 2 occasions has carried out what was technically an act of war against us, namely the attacks that accompanied the Litvinenko and Skripal murder attempts. If you deploy state force in anger, in an attempt to kill somebody who's living under the Queen's peace, I think that is technically an act of war. So it's not as though Russia was peacefully minding its business and not crossing our radar. But the more direct answer is this. In December 1994, Ukraine was persuaded to give up all of the nuclear arsenal it had inherited from the USSR in exchange for an absolute commitment that it would have its territorial integrity defended within its existing frontiers, a commitment guaranteed by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. For Russia then to turn around after Ukraine has denuclearized and invaded must rank as one of the most grotesque betrayals in history. And so I think as a country with honor, we have no option but to see this as our fight. I don't think we have the option of sitting back and pretending that it's a faraway country of which we know little. My noble friend Baroness Meyer said, well, if any of the participants in the First World War had known how it was going to end, they wouldn't have joined in. I'm sure that's true. Nonetheless, it's worth dwelling on the fact that the 2 most terrible wars we entered into in the 20th century were provoked not because our sovereignty was threatened, not because we had been directly attacked, but because we took seriously our commitment to defend the independence of friendly countries. If we're not prepared to stand for the international order, for the rule of law among nations, and for the rights to sovereignty of a friendly people, then we're not the kind of country I thought we were.